Hello and welcome to What Would Jesus Tech? My name is Andrew Noble. I'm one of the co-hosts here, joined with Austin Gravley, another co-host. He is the social media manager at the Gospel Coalition. He knows all about this stuff. I should probably, Austin, just interview you for this series that we're doing on digital marketing. I think that would be beneficial in and of itself. But
I think
today we
do
are
a Patreon episode about this at some point, give something to our Patreon audience.
Yes, and we do have bonus content on Patreon. At least once a month we have bonus stuff, and we're giving out free books right now to those who sign up. I mean, free in quotes, if you will. And also we have a Discord group that it's not gated. You literally just click the link in the show notes and you can join our Discord group. Joining us today is a pastor. I was checking and I'm like, we've had over 60, almost over 70 now episodes. And I don't know if we've had an actual pastor, just not any slash, just like you're a pastor. So Luke Simmons, he is the lead pastor of Ironwood Church in Arizona, which he was part of planting in 2009. He's been in full-time pastoral ministry since 2004, which if you do the math is many years. He coaches leaders, church planters, and pastors. He is part of the website and the resources available at faithfulandfruitful.com. He has degrees Covenant Theological Seminary and the University of Illinois. Luke, thanks so much for joining us. I know you through Twitter primarily, which you've done a good job of growing. You're at over 5,000 followers now, and you were apparently just 2 years ago at 1,000. Is that right?
Yeah, I was pretty much a lurker for, 12 years or so. And anyway, it's great to be here and good to talk with you guys. I can't believe I'm the first pastor. That feels like,
I know.
I don't know. Do I get a shirt or some swag or something?
J.Y. Kim was on. He's a pastor. So
But he's pastor/author. He's got that slash on him.
I write stuff, just no one publishes it. So
fair enough. You gotta just give it away for free, I guess. All right. So you do believe in using Twitter, as we've just referenced. You do believe that pastors should use social media. Is there a simple yes or no to that question? Should pastors use social media?
I wouldn't want to totalize that. I'd say for many pastors, it'll be a helpful tool. But you'd have to know why you're using it. And I think for other pastors, it'd probably be a specific danger. So, I know plenty of guys that I have a lot of respect for who are very almost like conscientious objectors to it for usually good reasons. I wouldn't want to say everyone should, but I do think that most pastors should think much more intentionally about how they use digital resources and digital tools to help disciple their people. I think every church should be paying more attention to that.
Perfect. That's helpful, because if you were too much on one side or the other, we'd stop recording and we'd say, we want to use wisdom, not just a knee-jerk reaction to some of these tools that we have. So can you talk about some of the potential harms? We're going to spend most of this episode talking about the fruits of digital media and that sort of thing for pastors and churches. But can you just speak to the harms and some of your concerns or dangers that you might have for some pastors?
Sure. I mean, different platforms and different tools have different dangers, I think. I don't think they're all created equal. I think a big tool or a big danger for a lot of pastors is purity related. I mean, it doesn't take very long at all to get into areas that are enticing lustfully and dangerous for our souls in that way. So I think that's a huge danger. A lot of the guys I know who just avoid it, it's mostly about that. Similarly, I think Facebook is a spot where over the last handful of years, I've heard of more and more people who end up rekindling old relationships or, ending up in affairs because of, stuff that got connected that way. So, I mean, I think that's a real, just from a moral perspective, if it's helping you do ministry, but it's leading you into immorality, it'd probably be a good time to pump the brakes. So I think that's a one. And then I think the other big danger is just there's a lot of scripture, I think, especially about in 2 Timothy, where it talks about that pastors shouldn't be quarrelsome. And there's a lot of quarrelsome ick on lots of social media platforms, particularly Twitter and particularly Facebook. Twitter, it seems to be much more with people out there, at least for me. A lot of our people aren't that engaged on Twitter, but a lot of our people are engaged on Facebook. And so you can be pretty contentious with people in your real life, maybe more on Facebook. If you want to be contentious with people out there, it's easy to do that on Twitter. I'm sort of stunned by the number of people who on Twitter, it's like an anonymous account.
Yes.
But then the like bio says pastor of something. And I'm just like, I just don't even understand. I don't get that at all.
It's amazing. It's amazing just how prevalent that is. It's almost hard to grasp just how big of a thing that is until you actually start really digging into it. It's a big problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you get into the other tools like Instagram Reels, or, I mean, I guess everything has Reels now, right? Everyone's trying to TikTok the reel game. And, you know, so I think there's lots of dangers around distraction and around, you know, just attention and kind of the way that these technologies seem to rewire our brains. So I think all those things that really everyone should be a little bit afraid of, I think pastors should be as well. You know, I've found just for me, like I read fewer books than I used to. Part of that has to do with social media. Part of that has to do with podcasts and YouTube. I mean, I guess all these things are technically under the umbrella of social media. So a lot depends what we're talking about. There's probably dangers too, in terms of the comparison game. You know, just what is this church doing? Oh, that church looks like they're really got cool stuff. You know, I think that's always been there. I mean, when I planted the church in 2009, you know, really social media it was hard to see what was going on in other churches, but I still had a dozen churches or so where I'd look at their website every few weeks to try to figure out what they were doing, you know, and, you know, that was simultaneously a way to learn, but also a way to compare and either feel better or worse about yourself on that basis. So it's funny. I mean, as I say all that, all of those are the dangers probably for everybody. But I think with the level of responsibility we have as pastors and the level of appropriate kinds of scrutiny we're under, we probably have to be even more on guard about how we steward that.
Yeah, that above reproach line is a kind of a catch-all for so many things, and it's supposed to be visible to not just those within your congregation, but outside as well. And that's social media is an opportunity for a pastor to display whether they are qualified to be in ministry. I think that's a real danger. And yet we can use social media for good and other media tools. You're right. We're not just talking about specifically the stereotypical apps. We're thinking about the social internet more broadly. We're thinking about what pastors should do. Do you want to just briefly tell your story about what you've kind of journeyed through over the last few years and what you've thought to add? I know one of the things that you thought to add was a podcast. And interestingly, you would say that that's a local first podcast as opposed to, you know, when a pastor thinks, oh, am I building a brand for this amorphous audience? Who am I even podcasting for? It's like, no, you can do these things for your local ministry. So tell us about your story and what you've kind of done and added, obviously not just yourself, but your team. But tell us about that.
Well, from the time we started it, like when we started the church, our first website was a WordPress blog, you know, that we eventually then transitioned into like an actual website. But then we kept the pastor's blog. And that was a place where I would write additional articles, write various reflections. That would be a place where from time to time I might in a sermon say, hey, there's more we could go into on this that I'm not going to cover. I've posted some resources over there on the blog. And so, you know, use that for a long time that way and have continued actually now on our church website we have an articles page. We don't post on it as frequently, but we've, you know, kept that as especially like a resource bank for various things that we refer people to. So I think digital technology can become a really helpful like library or repository of that content. You know, it's very helpful if you get the same question over and over about something, how many times do you want to rewrite that email to answer it? It's a lot better sometimes to go, hey, here's actually a place where we've addressed that, whether that's a podcast episode or a video or an article. And then now when we talk, let's still get together and talk. But when we talk, we're now starting at a reference point versus having to talk to have me explain whatever. So anyway, so that's something that's been there in the mix. We've always had a church email. A lot of churches have a church email, but that's really gone through an iteration of I bet probably 6 or 7 years ago, the open rate on that was probably around 20%.
Mm-hmm.
And it was mostly stuff going on in the church, announcements, dates, promotion, right?
Here's a list of the exact same things almost every week.
Yeah.
With a few changes and a few updates, but just a list of the bulletin.
Yeah. And the subject line would be what's happening at the church. It was the same every week with a different date attached, and, the more and more I just thought about the way people engage with our church, the more I realized like a lot of people engage with the church the way I engage with my kids' soccer team. All my kids played soccer, and I thought about soccer on the way to the game, at the game, and for about the first 3 minutes on the ride home from the game. And then I didn't think about it again after that. And
that's really good.
And when they sent me emails about whatever, I mean, unless it was like, hey, practice is canceled or the field's wet, so we can't, like, I'd noticed that, but otherwise it was just like the Charlie Brown's teacher, like I just ignored it. And I realized that's actually how people are experiencing our church. I mean, a lot of people, they're in a group or they're in a whatever, but they're not thinking about this all day like we are. They're not, waiting at their computer or on their phone. I hope the church will send me the latest events that are coming up. I mean, they don't care. And so I just realized like people are treating our communication like I treat that. And so what if we tried to change that? Here's this, I mean, man, we have hundreds, it's now, thousands of emails of people that are saying like, I'm okay with you sending me something. What if we send them something they might actually find helpful or valuable? So we made an intentional shift about 6 or 7 years ago to really start leveraging that email, that weekly email, where it still has dates and information and stuff. But the beginning of it is almost always written by me. And it's really, I'd say 8 out of 10 or 9 out of 10 times, it's a devotional thing, or it's a resource I'm sharing. It's a value add.
Yeah.
And it's not really a promotion. Or if it's a promotion dressed up in a value add. And we've seen the open rate on that go to almost 70%. And it's been really remarkable to see just how like that's felt like low hanging fruit to say, here's just one more way to be a resource. I mean, I've described being a pastor as there's this cultural forest fire raging and you get a squirt gun on Sunday. And you shoot it, and most of the time the water has evaporated from the heat before it even hits the flame. Like it's gone. And so I just go like, well, if you could upgrade that little squirt gun to a super soaker, you're still like putting the fire out, but you're at least making a little bit more of a difference. And so that's how I think about a lot of the digital tools. So then you go, okay, the podcast stuff we started, that was really, okay, it's 2020. No one can meet. What do we do? Let's start a podcast. And that really, in our particular case, solved a couple of issues that we were having. One is we wanted to just have more of a voice with our people during that time. The other is I've got a teaching pastor, Seth Trout, who also is a wonderful guy to follow on X. And he's just a very deep thinker, very good thinker. And I found, especially when he would preach, he'd preach probably about 30 or 40% of the time. There was always stuff he was trying to cram into his sermons. And I thought he needs an outlet to not do that. So it was a little bit of a filtering mechanism. So we created this podcast that we do 2 times a month. We thought that's a sustainable pace. We can do that. And it really is like, let's just experiment with it. And the more we experimented with it, the more we just got a lot of good feedback from our people. Like you said, Andrew, we approached it like the only reason people would listen to this is if they're part of our church, they know us. And we realize occasionally other people listen in, but that's not the audience we make it for.
Right.
And we thought, you know what, if that means 20% of the church listens to it, that'd be great. Like we couldn't do a class twice a month that we could get 20% of the church to go to.
That's exactly right.
So it's been a nice outlet. It also helps that for Seth and I we've both got a pretty deep well and are able to talk off the cuff pretty easily and pretty well. And so it doesn't, in our case, require a great deal more preparation. A lot of times it's being able to just use other stuff we've already done in the past or conversations we're already having. So that helps. I realize for some people, the idea of producing another thing would require a whole different level of preparation that thankfully in our case, it just doesn't take. But Yeah. So
Yeah.
that's long answer to your simple question, but that's
No,
some
no,
of how
no.
we've
I
approached
wanted it because I think a lot of pastors are at varying stages of what you just described, or you're the communications coordinator at your church. You're listening to this and you're like, oh, our newsletter or our email sounds just like what it used to sound. And what I hear is kind of a heart toward word ministry. And
Yes.
I feel like sometimes that's lost in churches, frankly. Like if I don't like to critique the evangelical church in North America with broad brushstrokes, but I do think that there can sometimes be a de-emphasis on teaching, word ministry, discipleship, in the understanding of a disciple is a learner. Like we really do need churches to be teaching, and there are conduits for that in our day to day. Even our church started a podcast just as an easy example for others. As we're going through this, we're just going through 52 weeks, the New City Catechism. So like maybe 25% of the podcast is just, because it's only 15 minutes long, is just reading. We just read the question from the New City Catechism. We read the answer. We read the scripture that's recommended with it. And then, yeah, there's easily something to say about how we think about applying it, the three of us who co-host it. So it's not that hard to just create something for your local congregation to help disciple them. And yeah, sometimes there can be barriers to that. So how do you convince people to do it, to see the value of it? Because I think it's hard for some listeners, people using social media, almost receptively, but they're not actively creating because they're like, I just, whatever their reason is. So how do you convince people?
Well, I mean, I think certain people probably shouldn't do it because they just, their plate's full, or the barrier to doing it in a way would be it would be life sucking for them, and it would drain them, and it just wouldn't be helpful. So like we started, I go, not everyone should. Some of it though, it's easier than you think. So like, especially on the podcast side. Now, if you have to have a beautiful studio where you're capturing video and you're posting all of that on YouTube, and it needs to be really fancily edited, it's going to be a pain. And you're not, you'll do one season and then you'll quit because it's like, this is right. But like, I've been stunned at the podcast thing. I think we bought a simple Rode podcast console that was probably $1,200, and some microphones, and you put the little SD card in and you hit record, and you talk, and then you hit record at the end and you pull the thing out. And I mean, we do all the editing. A volunteer does it on GarageBand. For a long time, my teenage daughter was the editor on GarageBand. We found some intro music and some outro music, and every few episodes we'd go, hey, cut out the 30 seconds at the blah blah blah. But it was like that was way less work than writing a 1,200 word blog post,
or getting the facility set up and all the chairs put out and everything to get people physically in a room. Yeah. So some of it is like, it's not as hard as it might sound, I think, in some of those cases. Like we're about to start adding a video component to some of our podcasts, and it's going to get way more complicated. And part of me goes, are we even going to like it? So we'll see. But I still think you have to start there. Then on the email side, it's like, somebody is already spending time doing this. Why not make it good? Why not make it where they'll read it? Right? Like, either cancel your weekly email or do it in a way that people will open it, read it, engage with it, care about it. But it's kind of like, why bother if it's just otherwise it's just a waste of time. So I think those are some reasons. I also think just in general, like, people are being formed by digital resources. They just are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you either can be part of that, or you can hope that everywhere else they turn is good enough, and I just think, like, I'd like to at least have a voice in it, So I think that's a compelling reason to do it. And then we've talked about some of the other reasons, I think, is like, having an outlet for some deeper content, having a place for, okay, here's additional resources where we want to, go into developing a resource bank of, oh, here's some episodes we did about this common question we get, that kind of stuff. I just think it's certainly the kind of thing where you won't feel the blessing of a lot of that stuff in a month or in 2 months.
But if you can figure out how to do it for a year or how to keep doing it for even a couple years, there's like a compounding interest.
Yes.
Dynamic.
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is something that I see kind of in my own lane on the digital media ministry side of things. Is that a lot of people don't have content problems. They actually have a lot of times more content than they know what to do with. They have a workflow problem, and if they can solve the workflow problem, the content will flow pretty freely through that. So, and like you were talking about with podcasts, the workflow for podcasts is not very complicated, and you don't need all that much to get started. But what you need just needs to be sustainable.
Yeah.
Over it needs to be shock absorbent. So if you've got a crazy week, you have funerals or holidays or special services or something like that, it doesn't take too long to get it in. Like, it doesn't require moving heaven and earth to get an episode out.
Right.
But for a lot of, I think of so many of the pastors I know, if they just had a real easy way to sit down in front of a microphone and just talk for a little bit, they could immediately double what they're doing on a weekly basis and edifying their churches. And it's not that difficult.
Yeah. And I mean, if people want some ideas, I mean, I've got a couple ideas that I think people could do. I mean, like our podcast, we call it King and Culture. And behind the scenes, I call it the Wind Seth Up and Let Him Go podcast. So I just know he's thinking about stuff related to cultural stuff. And so I just know, hey, like we sit down before we record. I go, what are we talking about? And he tells me. I say, okay, how will we know when we're done? And then my job is to just keep it on the rails, right? So that's what we do. Obviously, not everybody has a person like that, but I've thought of other things that people would do. Like, I think you could do a One More Thing podcast that would be like, some extra application or some extra like going, next step related to the sermon. I know some churches have done like a cutting room floor type thing. Here's the stuff that didn't make it into the sermon.
Yeah.
I've gone back and forth on that because I've thought, on one hand, that's interesting. Everyone always wants to know, what did you leave out? On the other hand, if it was important, you would have not cut it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I do get nervous about like, hey, let's build a resource ministry around this stuff that's not that important. Feels like, well, why would you do that?
That's what tweets are for. Like, that's why, anything, if I'm writing something and then I'm like, oh man, this is a great C.S. Lewis reference. And then I go, wait a second, it doesn't fit this at all. This is like a completely different subject. So I'll just tweet it. And then I get it off my chest, so to speak. And I've learned to just be okay with that. And then all of a sudden people will follow you as you tweet things that are interesting to you, and you end up just putting it there. But
totally. Yeah. I mean, I have other ideas. I think the Ask Pastor John podcast that John Piper's done forever.
Yeah.
Like a church doing their own version of that wouldn't have to be every day, but it's like every pastor has questions they get answers to. And people, and here's someone would go, well, why would I do that? Because everything's already been answered by John Piper. I go, well, because they're not going to listen to John Piper, but they're going to listen to you.
Yes.
And so I just think there's stuff like that it's like, you can just, whatever someone else is doing, just do your version of it. And the reason people will listen is because you're their pastor.
Yeah. They want to hear what you
care
think.
about what you think. Yeah, totally. So I think there's opportunities there.
Yeah. Can you just go into that a little bit more? Because I think some of the temptation I think it's very helpful to link to resources, for example. The temptation will be with AI and using it in a negative way. There's positive ways to use AI in what we're talking about, and maybe that'll be the other side of this question. But there can be kind of okay, I need to produce more content. I'm just going to ask for devotional on 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Great, cut and paste. That would be a lazy approach, and that wouldn't be from you. It's not actually what people want, because it's not your language. It's not from your heart. It's not your own emotions, and your heart, soul, mind, strength together is what God created you to be. And you need to use all of that in your pastoral ministry, including in the letters that you write, just as Paul did, or the emails that you send. So I'm thinking about AI going into this, and I'm thinking about the importance of that point. What other things would you say in relation to going through this process and creating it by yourself? Or maybe it's repurposing stuff that you've already built.
Yeah, I mean, repurposing is a huge deal. And that's what, I mean, Austin, you were talking about that a minute ago as well. The problem is not a content problem. It's a workflow problem. But it also is it's a packaging problem.
That too.
And that is like actually not that hard to figure out, but you have to do a little bit of work there. like, I mean, everyone talks about how, hey, if you're going to do a reel, the first 3 seconds, someone's going to decide whether they scroll past it or not. Right. So you're going to figure out, okay, here's the same content, but I got to arrange it in a different way to make it someone actually stop their scroll. Right. Or you could have a wonderful thought that you post a tweet on. Well, actually the formatting of that tweet and how long the sentences are and how it looks and how many line breaks, like some of that stuff actually matters in terms of whether people, so, but that's not that hard to figure out. You just have to do a little bit of work to figure it out. So, but once you do that, it's like, okay, we can repurpose this content. And there's lots of good tools, like Pulpit AI is a tool that we've used that I think does help at least try to say, okay, here's this thing you've created. How do we help you repackage some of that? So I think, some of that you still got to massage a little bit.
Sure.
But yeah, what comes to mind as you were talking, Andrew, was I think about how there's pretty much no shows on TV. I mean, no one watches TV anyway, but the people who do watch TV, there's no shows that are just the news anymore, whether it's sports or like, global geopolitical stuff. There's very few like just news shows. What they are is talking shows about the news or about the sports. Like, cause you go, I can find out anywhere what the score of the Lakers game was. I want to know, what does Colin Cowherd think about LeBron this year? Right. Because you value his voice, or you don't like his voice. So you listen to Stephen A. Smith, or so I think a lot of that's a lot of how things are, is like, okay, here's this thing that happened. What's this person's take on it? What's their analysis of it? What is their unique contribution to it? And I do not think that pastors should turn into like talking head. Let's just, become pundits about the latest hot takes of whatever. But I do think like the thing that's said, and it's been said, and you don't really have anything that fresh to say about it, you go, wow, who cares? The people would listen to it. Some people would. A lot of people don't care. They aren't going to listen to it. But some of your people would actually listen to this. I mean, think about what books haven't been written yet. I mean, they've all been written. Yeah. Right. But so like, as I think about, well, would I want to write a book? Yeah, I would at some point. And then I'd be, on your podcast as a pastor / author.
There you go.
And I'm like, why would anyone read it? Well, because I wrote it, and some people would care about that.
But also too, there's something to be said too, that like the only way to ever get good at something is to do it badly enough times to learn how to be able to do it well. And so even if nobody listens to your podcast, or if you make a reel or something, it gives you a chance to practice saying something you want to get good talking about. And so maybe people didn't watch your reel or watch your YouTube video or whatever, but since you practice talking about that thing, that comes up in conversation with a church member, in between services one day or Sunday, you've already done the legwork to familiarize yourself with what you would say in that moment. So there's a training aspect to the content that you're working with that goes beyond even just the content itself. You're actually training yourself how to be able to engage with people in everyday conversation.
Yeah, well, and there's a reality of like, you aren't leading anything till you communicate.
Right. Yeah.
Right? Like that's actually one of Albert Mohler's in his book, The Conviction to Lead. He says that leadership doesn't happen until communication happens. And so like, if you think about it, there's actually no such thing as a thought leader.
Right.
All there are communicators. Right. The reason you think someone's a thought leader is because at some point they wrote it down, or they shot a video, or they spoke it into a microphone, or they gave a talk. And so it's kind of like if a leader has a brilliant insight and doesn't tell anyone, did they have it? Like the tree that falls in the forest, like who cares? Yeah. And so I think that's a lot of like, if we're leaders, we are communicators. And again, that doesn't mean we have to swing at every pitch. That doesn't mean we have to communicate about every little thing. But I just think there's a lot of really great pastors that are leaving tons of low-hanging fruit unpicked with their people. And as a result, they're turning it over to, some national platform pastor, or worse, to some, other voices that they would probably not love shaping their people. So I think it's just a big opportunity for a lot of churches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're not saying this is going to replace your weekly ministry on Sunday. You're not saying it replaces important pastoral care and visitation and things like that. But this is something additive to your church. I'm curious about the thought process around how do you pick and choose what to talk about? Like, our church has a podcast called Thinking About It. Now, we used to have a seminary professor who would come in, and he was very thoughtful on contemporary events and issues. So it could be a little bit more edgy because we trusted him to answer things like, should we mask in churches or not? And that was very difficult to respond to, but we trusted him to deal with that alongside our lead pastor. So you do need to be thoughtful. I've personally struggled with this. I remember maybe it was 4 or 5 years ago, when I felt I couldn't say anything publicly that I wouldn't want an unbeliever to see and then grow a false impression. So it was kind of like, well, I can't say anything negative about the LGBTQ community. I can't do this. Like, I can't even say something about complementarianism or whatever, I'll just have to be super focused on just apologetics rather than, because it's available to everyone. So it'll just be apologetics. And then I just didn't post very much. But then if I look at who's following me, it's Christians.
Right.
And then I look at what they're reading and it's not good. So
yep.
I'm like, I need to be okay with speaking up. And I saw other people on social media and I was like, oh, they're just speaking their mind about what they're reading. They're just going through their day-to-day life, sharing what interests them. And yeah, sometimes it's going to be, there's a lot of similarities between transgenderism and transhumanism. Isn't that interesting? And that's it. And it's like, yeah, you're probably not going to get canceled actually when you tweet that out because it's only 10 people read it or whatever. But I do want to be thoughtful about picking and choosing and not going into hot topics. So what's your pastoral wisdom on that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, what you just said actually, I think, has the insight to it. Is you're figuring out, who am I trying to communicate to in this medium? So like, there's right, Andrew, you said we first connected through Twitter. Well, someone follows me on Twitter, what they'll notice is it's like 80 to 90% content aimed at pastoral leaders. I don't post that stuff on my Facebook page because that's like 90% of the people following me are like high school and college friends and like people in our church and people in my community. Like they don't care about that. And it in my case happens to work out that there's not that much overlap, but we do have people at our church that are on Twitter and they follow me on Twitter and I know they see what I put there. And so I do have to be mindful of, okay, this, this is all out there. People can see it. None of it's secret. But you're thinking, what's the medium for this? Who's the target audience? Right. So there's ways we're going to talk on a podcast to our church that would be different than I would talk as a guest on your podcast, probably, or different than I would talk if I was trying to, build a Instagram Christian resources, handle. So like, I think you figure out who are you aiming at, and then how do you want to talk to them? So in our case, like you mentioned your church podcast and our church podcast, I was just going back and looking at our episodes. They're almost all just stuff related to things we've been doing as a church or thinking about as a church, right? We're teaching Hebrews. So we had a recent episode going deeper on the book of Hebrews. And, we were in Advent. And so we did an episode related to Advent. You had the political election last fall. We did a number of episodes on how to think through those various things. Like the other day, Seth and I were talking about, we're just seeing all this rise in gentle parenting as a philosophy. Yeah. And we're going, we should do an episode about that because we're getting questions about it and we're seeing stuff about it. And so it's really arising out of our pastoral ministry. The question, like if we get a question a few times or some version of the same question a few times, we go, we should add that to the list. Let's do a podcast about that. And then there's other things you just go like, hey, this is just going to be interesting or relevant, or here's we've started doing a few more interviews of, authors and stuff like that. I think there's so much of that out there. I don't want to do too much of it. But there is an opportunity to say, okay, let's have this woman who's especially good talking about singleness. Let's have her talk about her book about that. That'll be a helpful resource for some of our people. So, or, here's this person that they do a lot on devotional life. Well, everyone in our church, we hope, has a good devotional life. So let's talk with them about it. So it's that kind of stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of things I'm interested in. Like I love the Denver Broncos. We're not talking about that. No one would care about that. So anyway.
Yeah, I'm curious, Luke, how do you balance on the one hand, as a pastor and as a leader of your church, you're looking out for these are things that our people need to know about. These are things our people need to pay attention to that I think are important for you to consider versus the things that your people are interested in and you speaking to them. Because there's a way in which we can just default to, I think this is interesting and so you should too. And it doesn't actually benefit the people that you're serving. So how do you balance the stuff that you're interested in and that you think your people should consider versus the stuff they're dealing with and you're trying to speak pastorally to that?
Yeah. Well, every preacher should be good at this.
I would hope so.
Now, we're not always, but we should be, because essentially that's what preaching is every week. Like, right. I think the difference between teaching and preaching, I think teaching assumes people are interested. I think preaching says I have to make them interested. And, this Sunday I'm preaching on Hebrews 6, because we're just walking through Hebrews, and it's the passage about, can people lose their salvation? And, in our church of, 1,900 people, there might be 3 people maybe who come in on Sunday with that as like a burning issue. And right. I have to somehow make that issue relevant, at least for the next 35 minutes. So like some of it is like there's things they already come pre-primed caring about, right? Those are the questions you're getting and you're going, okay, we can create content around that. And then other things you go, hey, you don't necessarily care about this, but I think you should. Mm-hmm. And part of good communication is figuring out how to communicate it in such a way to make you care about this. Right. And I think on some of those things, I mean, if all it is all the time is like, here's the stuff you don't care about, but you should, that sort of wears thin.
Yeah.
If you can meet enough of the like kind of felt needs, the bubbling to the surface questions, speak to those, I think that then gives you also the opportunity to go, hey, here's something I really think you should care about. And when you've earned that trust, especially with your people, they go, oh, I didn't know about this or care about this, but because my pastors do, I think I should maybe think about this, So mm-hmm. I think you have influence. You got to steward it well. I don't want people to just, believe everything I believe necessarily. I want them to, be good Bereans and search the scriptures. So,
mm-hmm. Which is another aspect. I was actually thinking about that as you were talking. There is a critique. I've heard some people critique the Ask Pastor John podcast. It's, some of it goes against the celebrity pastor culture that sometimes exists, where John Piper acts as like a mini pope or whatever. And then there can be kind of the non-denominational churches who are silos of just trust your pastor. You got to follow him on all his socials and he is the pope. He is the guru. There's, and I do hear something in that critique. I do kind of think about, oh yeah, are we encouraging a broader set of resources? Are we thinking about church history? Are we thinking, about how the Spirit doesn't just speak to your pastor, it speaks to others as well. And so how do you kind of balance on one hand, within a church, like I think some churches, they just prioritize the lead pastor and his insight and guru nature. Like it even sounds in what you're describing, you're like, Seth is the guy. Like even your disposition is different than what stereotypical, church planter, founder, you're like, no, Seth is the guy. Like you're really have a team. But there can be, I just have a concern within me about the personality cult that can exist within churches and the way that the digital mediums can kind of multiply that effect rather than allow for something that's broader and more Catholic with a small c. So what are your thoughts on that challenge?
I love that concern. And I think it's a real concern. I'll say the people who have that concern probably don't have the problem. Right. So like
probably
person who's an aspiring celebrity pastor, and by the way, I think there's plenty of small church pastors who have the same disease. Like everything has to revolve around them.
100%.
They can't delegate anything, right? They're, it's a pope with a smaller Vatican
footprint, with a smaller footprint. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think for the pastor who is like, I don't want to be that, that's probably more a sign that you should be that. Right. So like one of the things we talk about in not that you should be that, but that you should get your voice out there, so
yeah. I know what you're saying.
We've been talking about in masculinity, masculinity, like one of the key things that makes a man is that he has chivalry. It's strength that honors. Right. And if you think about masculinity done poorly, well, it might look like a peacock that's strutting around. Hey, look at me, look at me, look at me, putting on a show for the females. Right. That's a version, like when we think of toxic masculinity, that's what we think of. Mm-hmm. But there's another kind of, anemic masculinity, which is the male black widow spider. I don't know if you've ever seen a male black widow spider, no. But it's the black widow, the female is beautiful and big. Mm-hmm. And the male is called she's called the black widow because the male is this tiny little insignificant brown thing that she like destroys.
Yep.
And so when you think about manhood, right, one problem is peacocks and one problem is male black widow spiders. Yeah. And I think we're so conditioned to appropriately be afraid of being a peacock that we end up being a male black widow.
That's exactly right.
And so I think it's a good thing to be concerned about. I don't ever want to stop asking the question you asked. Hey, is this me making this about me? Am I trying to be somebody that's important? But I think if you're worried about that, you probably have more room to like put yourself out there and lean into it.
Totally. No, that's really helpful advice, even to my soul right now in this moment, as we're recording, because I once heard it said, you're always going to have some mixed motives, like the hitting post on that Twitter thing, you have been conditioned to really enjoy the likes and when people retweet, you're like, whoo, like I got retweeted by Austin Gravley. Like I've made it, you feel good. That dopamine hits, you have the whole cycle. It's that bright red notification. And yeah, you know that there's something in you that shouldn't enjoy that. And yet at the same time, I do believe that gospel rooted word that I wrote in that tweet or whatever it is. And I do think there is wisdom in that I am glad more people. And so I do want it to multiply from a good, genuine basis. Right. Like, anyways.
Well, and it's like, if you were that worried about it, you wouldn't be, talking to the person who's worried about it, you wouldn't be a pastor.
Right.
Like you wouldn't get up and stand on a stage under the lights with a microphone on your face and preach every week if you were that worried about it. So like already you're having to do some sort of heart work, hopefully, that's saying, hey, there's everything about this could make this about me, but I'm not going to make it about me. I'm going to make it about Jesus. So it's the same thing. It's the same battle. It's the same fight. It's just a different medium. And so I think like, I just wonder how many people, being afraid of being a peacock never actually live out what God's calling them and inviting them to do. So
that's great. You did a talk about a year ago, helping pastors think through digital stuff. You had a section in there. You sent this to us ahead of time. So I was looking through it and you had a section called Random Stuff I've Learned. So I do want to pass it over to Austin, but I kind of want to go through some of these that jumped to me. Because you say, get a nice looking profile photo. You may be ugly, but the photo doesn't have to be.
Yes.
And I'll let the listener decide if he or she is ugly. But.
Okay. Yeah. You also say on video, audio is most important.
100%. It's not a
so we need good audio more than we need a good camera.
People will tolerate bad looking video and poor looking video so long as the audio is not nails on a chalkboard. If your audio is nails on a chalkboard, it doesn't matter what resolution or how nice it is physically painful to engage with.
Good. Next one that jumped out to me, when you write online, make every paragraph only 1 to 2 sentences. There's recently an article written by Samuel James, who is concerned about the growing short sentences argument. Any thoughts on writing online and catering to the medium for the masses?
I read his article about that. I think his critique was related to the John Mark Comer book.
Yeah.
And I do think like a book format's a different format than a digital thing. So I'm thinking there, especially about email, right? If you get an email and it's got a 5-sentence paragraph, it fills up your entire screen. And there's something just aesthetically about that makes you feel claustrophobic and like, I don't want to look at it. And you exit out or you scroll past it. And so some of it is like, if you're thinking, okay, most people are going to read this email on their phone. It's not, it's just making it hospitable. It's saying, here's a kind way to help you want to engage with this. So that's the thought there. I don't feel strongly about it in all forms of communication. It's again, thinking through what's the medium of this and how do I serve the people I'm trying to connect with on it.
That's good. Hospitality is definitely something that includes how you engage online. Super helpful.
Absolutely.
Good sermon titles will give it extra life on YouTube. So you don't have your YouTube sermons titled Sunday Worship, January 13th, 2023. You don't have that title? I thought that's the go-to title.
I know so many churches that are still doing this, and it makes me cry every time it shows up in my feed.
Well, and for us, it's funny because I'm not trying to build a global audience of our sermons. That does not move the needle for me at all. That said, if we're going to put it on YouTube and someone might have a spiritual question and they might search for something, I think there are worse places they could end up than my sermon. So I'd love for one of the options to be my sermon. So it's thinking about that. And that's even related to subject lines as well in emails is, the way I think about a lot of that is I want to give enough information for you to have some sense of what it is, but there needs to still be some mystery that makes me intrigued and go, oh, what is that? I want to click on that. I want to open that. I want to watch that. I want to learn more. So it's information and intrigue. And I think if you title stuff that way, it's funny. It's the same content, but again, more people engage with it.
Mm-hmm. And that includes people in your own church that might be scrolling your YouTube page and then they click on something and they benefit from it as well. For articles, you say only write for rank or reference. What do you mean by that?
So here I'm thinking about articles on your church's website. So there's writing for rank, which would be like, this is an article that will show up in search engines. Mm-hmm. And typically that means it's going to need to be perceived as something authoritative, something typically long. Like when I've actually been contracted by different people in content marketing world to write an article that's going to rank about X, Y, or Z, they actually pay you more money per word, which is funny because everything I've ever written is like, make it shorter, make it more succinct, make it less. So if you're writing an article that you go, when people search for how to practice Sabbath, that needs to probably be long. It needs to be detailed. It needs to have good headings. It needs to be something that the algorithms can recognize as, hey, this is a valuable resource that we're going to rank highly when people search for it. So that's writing for rank. Or I think it's writing for reference, which is to say, I'm going to write something that I'm going to be able to share later with people, or this is going to be part of the ongoing library. But if it's something you don't really plan to refer to, and it's something you're not necessarily hoping will show up in search engines, it's kind of a waste of time. It might be writing, like I think at that point, you're better off writing that same content on a Facebook post or on an Instagram.
Right. It's a reflection.
Carousel or whatever. Yeah.
No, that's helpful. Last one last one from me. In emails, always add a PS. So I don't normally add a PS, so convince me.
So this is not obviously in every interpersonal email, right? The emails that you and I sent back and forth
in a
about
newsletter,
setting this up.
in a weekly thing to the church or to men's ministry.
I can't explain it, but people always read the PS. They just do. And so it's just a spot where it's again another opportunity. I don't know, I can't remember who told me that, but I realized, you know what, I always do read the PS and I always do pay attention to it. And so a lot of times too, people will open an email and they'll sort of scan it, but then they will see the PS. And so it's a great place to either reiterate a key thing or to have another link to the thing you wanted to send them, or to, tell them something else important that feels unrelated. So yeah, I don't know why that works, but it does.
What's an example of what you'd write in the PS? Like just your email, it's an email to the men's ministry or to the church. Yeah, maybe whatever you want.
Yeah. You know what? I'll pull up here.
PS, go Broncos or whatever. I don't know.
No, it typically wouldn't be that. So this week for the email that I wrote for the church, it was an email about a class that we have coming up on finding your place in the biblical story. And so the PS was, hey, baptisms are coming up Easter weekend. If you're interested, learn more here.
Yeah.
The week before that,
nice.
It was an email that was more of a devotional on a part of Psalm 78. And then the PS was, hey, on our most recent episode of the King Culture podcast, we talked about XYZ, click here, so sometimes it's related to what the email is and sometimes it's unrelated, but it's another way to get also pay attention to this kind of thing in there. Mm-hmm. So
super helpful. Really appreciate how you are being aware of the medium and then leveraging it effectively through understanding the medium. So that's been super helpful.
Yeah, great.
Austin, anything else to add? Or ask,
yeah,
I should say.
So if you're talking with someone who's maybe thinking about spinning up some kind of digital media ministry and they don't know where to start, what would you advise them to do as like common first steps?
First, I would try to see if there's someone in your church that's in this space already. Lots of churches have people in some form of digital marketing. And it's funny, I even think about in our church, I know guys that would all say they're in digital marketing, but one of them's in SEO and one of them's in more of the content thing. Yep. One of them's in email and one of them's in web design. And so it's not all the same thing. But chances are in a lot of churches, there's somebody who has some expertise in that and experience in that. And I think starting with them and saying, here's some ideas I've had. What do you think? Like, will you just provide advising on this? Chances are they'll know some good examples you could look at, or they'll know someone else you could talk to, or they might say, wow, that sounds really interesting. I'd love to help with that. So I would start there. Who are people that have the expertise you don't have, and start listening to them. I think obviously people are already listening to this podcast. So a resource like this would be a great place for people to continue to dive in. I think Brady Shearer with Pro Church Tools is excellent. Yeah. A lot of the stuff that I've learned has come from different videos and content and things he's put out. So he's a great person to pay attention to. And then I would just say, like, iterate, try stuff, do something small, see how it goes. I think you probably need to commit to doing something for, 2 or 3 months.
At least. Yeah.
Yeah. But, give it a shot, give it a try. Sometimes it helps to bank some things up on the front end, before you launch something. But I think so many times the perfect is the enemy of the good. And
100%.
That idea that, hey, this is just good enough to move on and keep going, like just do that. And especially if you're not doing much, a little goes a long way.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to get your reps in. Your reps don't have to be perfect. They just need to be reps, and they just need to be good ones.
Great. Well, this has been super helpful, Luke. We are at the end of the hour. Do you think Jesus would use social media?
Wow, that's a good question. What would Jesus tech? Yeah, I think certainly he would have.
I think so too.
Well, this has been What Would Jesus Tech with Luke
Or at least
Simmons.
He would have had some of his disciples
that's my
using it to cover him.
Yeah.
Don't give Judas the login to the Jesus X account.
I feel like Matthew would be pretty good follow on there.
Matthew would be good. Yeah. If he took notes, I don't know. But yeah, no, this is a fascinating conversation, really practical, and helpful, and I think instructive. So thanks so much for sharing your wisdom, and being okay with podcasting and tweeting so that I could find out about you and sharing that kind of stuff online. It is good to use digital mediums, guys. Don't be afraid of it, even if you have mixed motives. I am Andrew Noble. This has been What Would Jesus Tech? Use tech, find rest, and glorify God. Join the Discord too. Link in the show notes. Take care, guys. Bye now.